After assets enumeration and threat modeling, we need to do an analysis of the probability and impact of each threat. This step is a part of the risk assessment. Now that we have the list of unwanted events, threats, we need to think which one is the worst that can happen and create a ranked list. As we almost never have the resources to deal with all of the risks, we have to prioritize. To do so, we should measure these threats, unwanted events, by using some parameters such as probability and impact. An unwanted event, threat, evaluated in light of its probability and impact is actually a risk. The threat, unwanted event, with the highest probability and impact will be the highest risk in our ranking. The risk assessment process could be illustrated with a risk matrix. Let's use a 1, 2, 3 scale for both parameters, probability and impact. 1 for low, 2 for medium, and 3 for high. To assess the probability of a threat, we need to consider what has already happened in the past to us or to other organizations or individuals in our field or context. For example, if a certain incident happened during the previous 12 months, the probability might be considered as high. Here, it is important to communicate with other civil society organizations and exchange information about security incidents. It is very useful if someone takes the lead on creating and maintaining a list of incidents for a specific country. Apart from the statistics on what happened, the assessment of the probability will always be quite subjective and based on our expectations, feelings, as well as the expectation of people we trust. Impact can be measured more objectively. High impact isn't merely when individuals experience temporary sadness. It occurs when someone is incarcerated, harmed, or when an organization or individual can no longer pursue their mission. A medium impact on civil society could occur when there is a loss of funding, the emergence of non-critical legal issues, or some reputational damage. Although unpleasant, these situations do not hinder the pursuit of the organization's mission. While they may be challenging, costly, and uncomfortable, they allow the organization to endure and carry on with its vital mission. Finally, a low impact refers to temporary issues that do not significantly deplete resources, cause discomfort and frustration, but without resulting in any genuinely adverse consequences. Context defines everything here. What is actually happening in our context defines the probability, the consequences, impact, and the common practices. It is not possible to conduct a risk assessment and have a proper risk management process without knowing the context. That's why nobody else can do this work for us. Nobody understands the context better than us. Among the elements to look at and be aware of, there are the legal, international, regional, and national frameworks, the political context, socioeconomic issues, and human rights situations. Another important aspect to consider is our individual characteristics and differences. The same unwanted event might affect different organizations and people in different ways, or they might affect them in the same way, but for one organization or person, the event would be catastrophic, while for another it might have, let's say, a medium impact. When thinking about different individuals and how it can affect them, remember to be mindful of the assumptions you might have and your conscious or unconscious biases. Bringing in more people with diverse perspectives, you reduce those blind spots and biases. The management is generally responsible for organizing, implementing, and regularly reviewing the risk management process. But management also has to make sure that this is done in a collaborative, inclusive way, where everyone's context, gender, age, and background are reflected in the results. If you feel this works for you, the results of the risk assessment could be placed on the risk matrix. Let's look at our scenario again.
The areas in which staff members sometimes operate can be quite risky for human rights defenders. And in the past 12 months, there were incidents of representatives of human rights organizations being physically attacked there, as well as cases of vandalism on the premises of civil society organizations and media. There were also incidents of human rights defenders being injured during peaceful assemblies that turned violent. The staff of the Balronian Center for Human Rights prepared a plan to better protect their office premises and started refraining from participating in peaceful assemblies that have a history of turning violent. When the organization started working on monitoring the situation of human rights defenders in these risky areas, their workload increased tremendously, while their resources remained limited. Most staff members are working overtime and on the weekends. Luckily, there is trust within the team and all staff members can count on each other. But one staff member had to take a prolonged sick leave due to intense fatigue. On top of that, online smear and intimidation targeting the organization and its staff have intensified in recent times due to the increasing visibility of their work. This is really taking a toll on the staff, and they started to mentally prepare for it to get worse. While the Balronian Center for Human Rights has never faced case of hacking, there were some attempts in the past, but these were not successful. However, the organization heard rumors that the adversary is trying to increase its hacking capability. Distributed denial of service attacks on independent media, election monitors, human rights defenders, etc. are quite common in the context in which the Balronian Center for Human Rights operates. As a result, the organization is worried that such an attack, if it happens, might seriously disrupt their work, which depend on online servers and databases. At least so far, no data leak has ever happened.
In light of this information, where would you place the probability for each of these threats? Would you assess it as high or low? What about the impact? Try to evaluate the probability and impact of each threat and place them on a risk matrix. As a result of this exercise, we'll be able to identify and prioritize our risks. Let's start with staff members are physically attacked in the streets. Considering what we know about the context and that such incidents happened in the past, we would say the probability can be considered high. The impact could be high too, as they could seriously be injured as a result of an attack. This is a high risk, having high probability and high impact. Let's consider the case in which the organization's office premises are vandalized while staff members are inside the building. Since there were cases of vandalism in the past, we would consider the probability again as high. At the same time, the preparedness plan developed by the organization to handle such circumstances would make the impact of this threat quite low. So this is a medium risk. Another threat we considered is staff members are injured during an assembly. Since we know this has happened in the past, but the organization has now decided not to participate in certain assemblies, we would assess the probability as medium. The impact if this happens, however, would be quite high because of the potential consequences of injuries. So we can assess these as a high risk with medium probability but high impact. Moving on to our next threat, hackers hack the database and get access to the sensitive information and documentation. Let's consider what we know about the context. Based on that, we would assess the probability as medium. We would assess the impact as high because a lot of people would be compromised and might get injured or prosecuted if the threat occurs. In addition, the organization would no longer be able to pursue their mission. This risk then, under those circumstances, is quite high. Let's now look at another threat. Hackers perform a distributed denial of service DDoS attack on the database and make it unavailable. Since there were such cases in the past, we would say the probability can be assessed as high. Given that a big chunk of the work of the organization depends on database, and it is essential to keep it up and running, the impact of this threat would be high too. So this would again be considered a high risk. Let's now think about how to assess the situation in which one of the staff members or volunteers who have access to the database leaks all the data. Since this has never happened before, and the people who have access to the database are trusted members and volunteers of the organization, we would assess the probability of this threat as low. But the impact in case a leak happens could be assessed as high, like in the case the database is hacked. This is considered a medium risk, with low probability but high impact. Finally, let's have a look at our staff well-being and assess the situation in which the heavy workload coupled with limited resources leads to staff burnout to the point that they need to take extended sick leave due to extreme fatigue. We know that this has already happened to one staff member, and the workload has increased lately, so we would say the probability of this threat is high. As for the impact, this can also be assessed as high, considering that the organization is very small and staff members are already working overtime. This unwanted event would add even more pressure on the staff, and they would not be able to even take the time to hire new people in the middle of such a high-stress situation. So we can say this risk is high. Moving on to staff members feel highly demotivated and the feeling is spreading across the team. They provide lower quality outputs and results because they are overstretched and not able to work at the best of their capacity. We would say the probability of this threat is medium, as this has not happened so far, but the increased workload might cause it. This event could be quite disruptive to the quality of work of the organization, so we would also assess the impact of this event as medium. Hence, this could be assessed as a medium risk. Regarding online attacks on staff members are protracted over time and start targeting their family members, thus causing extreme worry and concern, we know that staff of the organization have sometimes been targeted with online intimidation and smear because of their work on sensitive topics, and such episodes have intensified lately. Given their increased exposure to this, we would assess the probability that such incidents occur as high. We would also say the impact of this threat is medium, as it would be quite disruptive for the work of the organization, but we know that staff members are starting to prepare for it. Overall, we would assess this risk as quite high. As you can see, for all these examples, the circumstances in which threats might occur play an essential role. Individual characteristics such as age, gender, and social, cultural, and other backgrounds might also play a role in assessment of risks. This once again shows how important the context is in the risk assessment and in a risk management process. Now that we have the list of our risks, let's put them in a descending order, and as we can see in this example, 6 of them are high risks, 3 of them are medium risks, and none of them is a low risk. Let's decide what to do with them. The second stage of the risk management process is about deciding how to deal with the risks. We are now moving to the risk treatment phase. What decision can we make on each risk? Please pause the video and try to think about it. Here are the 4 most common options. 1. Avoid. Eliminate the risk completely by not doing the activity, project, or travel. 2. Mitigate or reduce. Mitigate means to develop and implement security measures that reduce the magnitude of the risk to an acceptable level. In other words, they reduce the impact or probability of the risk, or both. 3. Share or transfer. We can decide to partially or fully share the risk with someone else. For example, we can choose not to develop our own database, but to use an already existing one, with security measures already implemented and maintained by its developers. 4. Accept. Acknowledge the risk and do nothing about it. It's totally up to you what decisions to make about the risks and how to name the decisions. You may come up with other options as well. Let's now get back to our example and take our ranked list of risks. We need to decide what to do with them. What's the risk treatment? Pause the video and think, what would you do? What actions would you take for each of them? For the risks about the physical integrity of staff members, Let's say we evaluated that sending people to areas that are risky for human rights defenders is too dangerous and decided not to make them go there. If we do so, we are avoiding the risk of staff members being injured or attacked. For the two risks related to the database, let's say we decided to use an already existing database instead of developing our own, so the security of the platform will be the developer's responsibility and not ours. In this case, we are deciding to share the risks. Since we cannot share the risk of one of the staff members or volunteers to have access to the database leaking all the data, we can decide to mitigate it. As for the risk of a staff member or volunteer going on extended sick leave due to heavy work fatigue and burnout, we could decide to mitigate it by setting well-being policies in place, including what we can and cannot allow for mental health in the workplace. For example, ensuring staff rotation, frequent leave days, or check-ins. At this point, if you feel you strongly or slightly disagree with some of these decisions, this is absolutely fine. The context in which you operate is different from the context we are imagining for these general examples, and your risks and decisions would be different. Again, security does not exist outside of the context. Different contexts mean different risks, different decisions, and different measures. This means that only by knowing the context very well, we can implement a proper risk management. Nobody can actually do risk management for us if they are not deeply immersed in our context.